With no disrespect to literature, I should never have applied such a term as crisis or turning point to the result of contact with a book or even a body of literature. I thought those things usually came about differently. For instance, Gustave Flaubert, the great pessimistic novelist, described how, as a young man, he was one day walking along the street in Rouen, and from a scullery window came the sickly odour of stale greens. Thereupon, in a flash, he understood the meaning of life. A crisis, as a rule, materializes in some such way as that. For a long time, there will have been gathering in the remote recesses of our consciousness an emotional residue of bitter or joyous or ecstatic experience. Then something occurs to cause it to crystallize and to take an unexpected shape, perhaps with a terrible distinctness and definition. Most about which we use the term crisis develops this way. Things are smouldering a long time, usually, before they burst into flame. If there is something rotten in the state of Denmark, it doesn't immediately assail the nostrils. In Flaubert's case, he must already have had a very low opinion of life. He did not, however, know that it stank. The disagreeable odour abruptly apprised him of that fact. Why should not a book, however, bring sudden enlightenment as much as anything else? And certainly I cannot recall any smell, either fragrant or offensive, which affected me so much as reading Shakespeare's tragedies or listening to Bach's music. Generally, it is when one is young that crises occur, though not, I think, when one is in knee pants. Today, for instance, I feel sure that many young Frenchmen are deriving from the existentialist books of Jean-Paul Sartre much the same type of pessimistic enlightenment that Flaubert received from the displeasing whiff. And those young men will have seen much in the past few years to prepare them for such a revelation. At all events, reflecting along these lines, I went on a search backwards into my young life to identify some really decisive experience. And at last I came up against a solid mass of books, not one book as I had thought I might, which supplied the answer. This was something that revolutionized my technique of approach to experience, that did not merely give me a great kick at the moment and then quickly faded as, as most things do. The mass of books to which I have referred is the creative literature of Russia. And when I took down some of these half-forgotten volumes, went again with Pierre in his incongruous white hat and green coat onto the field of Borodino, and with Raskolnikov lifted the axe to strike down the aged usurer, I very nearly had another crisis, hardened as I am now to such influences. In England it is rather fashionable at present to dismiss many of these books as unreadable. All I can say is that if another time and country is the obstacle, then the Socratic dialogues, Cervantes or Voltaire, would fall under the same ban. But, on the other hand, if Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Gogol Soloviev, Chekhov, are not considered of that rare perennial quality, then, fresh from my rereading, I politely disagree. Dostoevsky on the European continent continues to exercise a magical influence, as an instance of which I may cite the Swiss theologian Barth, who acknowledges two main sources of inspiration, namely Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard. I have noted several instances, by the way, in which these two names have been bracketed in this manner. In England, perhaps this decline in sympathy with such writers may be attributable either to the turning away from reality in an ostrich-like romanticism, or else to the growth of an inordinate appetite for intellectual smartness, of which there certainly is very little in the Russians. And they should not be looked upon either as a sort of rival to the contemporary Russian. A careful reading of the great Russian novelists assists, on the contrary, to an understanding of the Russian of today. Stalin dancing upon the table at a victory banquet is a page from Gogol. The unexpectedly able Russian generals beating off the panzers at Smolensk or before the capital itself, one recognizes as one reads of Kutuzov at Borodino, more than a match for Bonaparte. As a student in Paris, in French translations, I first read all these Russian books, and I lived for some time wholly in that Russian world of poor folk, in the tragic family circle of the Karamazov, with Verhovensky, Shigalev, and the Nihilists, with Rudin, losing interest and departing when he saw the spell he had cast had collapsed, listening to the Kreutzer Sonata and noticing the big hips of the ladies' man, or submissively assisting at all the exclamatory archness of the Varvaras and Natalies. So my crisis was even more than a collection of books. It was a world, as I have described myself as doing, tracing my steps back. I was not suddenly stopped by a wall of books. Rather, I passed imperceptibly into a warmer, richer atmosphere, as crossing the Atlantic one enters the area of the Gulf Stream. I heard again the raucous voice of La Babulenka crying, "You do not know what? By heavens, are you never going to drop that roulette of yours? Are you going to whistle all your property away?" And I saw the ruined General wilt before the glare of his aged mother, borne aloft like a carnival figure in an armchair. Paris was full of Russian students. This, of course, was before the Russian Revolution, who walked about in pairs, in tight black semi-military jackets. They conversed with no one. They were contemptuous of Western levity, stern and self-absorbed. It has been said that when Dostoevsky wrote The Possessed, there were in Russia no Stavrogins or Verhovyenskys, that they come much later, and this was a divination of the future. In that case, these characters, now become flesh and blood, were met by me every day on the boulevard, and they decidedly looked the part. These were the Puritans who were to dominate Europe, a generation with many points of resemblance to the black-coated sectaries who began to swarm in England in the first days of the 17th century, and who subsequently transmitted their passionate disciplines to and became the genius of the North American continent, the New World. The world of the imagination I inhabited at that time, however, was anything but Puritan, taken as a whole. For this great volume of creation, produced in the 19th century by a group of men over a space of 50 or 60 years, there is no parallel since the Renaissance, to which the Tudor stage, of course, was the greatest English contribution. The impression conveyed is of a release on the grand scale of prodigal energies. All the writers, it seems to me, responsible for this new world of the spirit are of the same half-Western, half-Eastern ethos, which, among other things, gives them a peculiar value, like everything about Russia. They must, in consequence, for the Western European, remain a great universalizing influence. And all the Russians, Tolstoy almost as much as Dostoevsky, were conscious of their curious relationship to the West, of it and yet not of it, conscious also of something like a mission with regard to it, namely as the purveyors of sincerity to the over-institutionalized European. A cultural seesaw of westernizing and anti-westernizing proceeded among the intellectual leaders, but to hold themselves apart from the West, a little contemptuously apart, was by far the most popular attitude. From The Gambler and elsewhere in the pages of Dostoevsky, a very shrewd analysis of the Western European could be compiled. There is, for instance, the Junker. I quote, "He had legs which seemed to begin almost at his chest, or rather at his chin. Yet, for all his air of peacock-like conceit, his face wore a sheepish air." Then there is the Frenchman. I quote, "He was a true Frenchman insofar as that, though he could be lively and engaging when it suited him, he became insufferably dull and wearisome as soon as ever the need for being lively and engaging had passed." Seldom is a Frenchman naturally civil. He is civil only as to order and of set purpose. Also, if he thinks it incumbent upon him to be fanciful, original, and out of the way, his fancy always assumes a foolish, unnatural vein, for the reason that it is compounded of trite, hackneyed forms. In short, the natural Frenchman is a conglomeration of commonplace, petty, everyday positiveness. No more today than yesterday, I think, do we appreciate how a genuine sincerity can take even a self-righteous form, and how insincere and untrustworthy in many respects the West must seem to those Puritans of the steppes, whose lineaments already are visible in the dramatis personae of the 19th century Russian classics. A great deal of what I read as a student I either did not understand or took no interest in. I knew, for instance, what I was witnessing everywhere in Dostoevsky, namely the almost muscular struggle of the human will to repulse evil and cleave to the good, or to embrace evil with a convulsive violence and then to repent with more convulsions. It was the unrelievedly gloomy epic of spiritual freedom, which the further you went got to look more and more like predestination. But in the first place, I was not myself of a gloomy temperament. Also, since I was not interested in problems of good and evil, I did not read these books so much as sinister homilies, as monstrous character patterns, often of miraculous insight. I am inclined, I find, to attribute to myself less understanding when I first read all these books than I in fact had. But what is quite certain is that the politics in Dostoevsky, almost as distinctive a feature of his work as the mysticism, and I now am of opinion far too much influenced by it, these very unusual politics were entirely lost upon me at that time. 3 years ago, I read again The Possessed. There were all the names and scenes, just as in the past, when first I read it. But it was a very different book. Evidently, as a student, I had read it somewhat as a child reads Alice Through the Looking Glass. That is the only possible explanation. Dostoevsky was an arch counter-revolutionary, and it is not only in The Possessed, which is the high watermark, almost a counter-revolutionary tract, that this passionate reaction is to be found. But when in his letters one reads that he thought of postponing a journey owing to the news which had greatly upset him of the death of the Tsar's aunt, that makes one feel that when he refers to himself in his diary as a conservative, in this one particular he was right. Yet what an extraordinary work The Possessed is. Stavrogin, Tikhon, Verhovensky, Shatov, what a prodigious company. Allowing for a great deal that was unintelligible, the impact of such books was due to much more than their vitality. Perhaps Ivan Karamazov supplies the correct answer when he is speaking of the young men who sat in the corners of the Russian taverns. I quote, "They've never met before, and when they go out of here, they won't see each other again for the next 40 years. But what do they talk about for the moment that they're here? Nothing but universal problems. Is there a God? Does the immortal soul exist? Those who don't believe in God discuss socialism and anarchism and the reorganization of mankind on a new pattern, which are the same questions, only taken from the other way up." That was what Russian boys had their minds filled with, apparently, and what these books showed them ardently discussing in taverns as they drank, as if the fate of the universe hung upon their words. Well, what do young Englishmen discuss under similar circumstances? Probably the dogs or football. What do young Frenchmen discuss? Undoubtedly women and their smartness and their smart handling of same. So it was in everything. Here was a more serious world altogether, thought I. Then what consummate realists these people were. with their slovenly old gentlemen with a great reputation for sanctity, the saintly fools of the monasteries, with their embarrassed, bashful smiles, smelling slightly of vodka, the police commissioners who behaved like a Marx brother, Napoleon Bonaparte persuaded that he was directing a battle, while in fact everyone had forgotten his existence and fought it in their own way. The Chagall-like figures skimming along the surface of the water in pursuit of the river steamer, and the overcoat of Gogol or his walking nose. I too came out of the overcoat of Gogol. Many things have happened to me since, but there was a time when I did not follow my own nose, but his. Paris for me is partly the creation of these books. I now realize that if I had not had Chekhov in my pocket, I should not have enjoyed my Dubonnet at the Lilas so much, or the beautiful dusty trees. It was really as a character in Tolstoy. I remember now that I visited the Bal Musette, and the hero of the first novel I wrote reminded a very perceptive critic of Stavrogin. In view of all this, I think we may really say that the first time moving down the Rue des Écoles, I arrived at my particular bookshop opposite the Montagne to find a book by Faguet, and took away letters from the underworld as well. Crisis was at hand.